Welcome to Real Talk, where we dive into the raw, engaging, authentic, and lived experiences that inspire and inform. I'm Michelle Badusky, your host, and I believe that the hardest conversations to have are the ones we need the most. This is a safe space for real talk that challenges perspective, sparks growth, and pushes boundaries. No filters, no fluff, just real talk. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Hey everyone, it is Michelle Badusky here with Real Talk, and I am very excited today to have Dr. Chris Schneider on my show, who is a professor of sociology at Brandon University, an author of 8 books now, with the 9th coming out? Something like that. And he's been published all over. The New York Times. You've literally been studying crime, policing, community safety for your whole career. So thank you so much for being here and talking to me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Well, the reason I reached out to you and the reason I really wanted to talk to you is because we have I won't even hesitate to say we have seen over the last few years an increase in a feeling of unsafety. That's not even a word, but that's the word I'm using. People are feeling unsafe. We've seen the drug crisis, we've seen a lot of mental health issues come through with COVID, and we are constantly being bombarded on social media about crime reduction, bail reform. The federal conservatives are coming out with, they want a 3-strike policy. They want all of these things. And my position has always been that, we can't arrest our way out of this, that we need to deal with crime and mental health and everything at their root cause, which starts with poverty reduction and all those good things. But it always seems, no matter what I say, because I'm so politically active, that it seems like it's partisan politics. And I wanted to talk to someone who is an expert on this. And that's you. You are the expert when it comes to community policing. And thank you for sharing your thoughts with me today.
Well, again, thanks for having me. And I don't know if I'm the expert. I know a little bit about some things, and most of my opinions, and I believe what we'll be talking about is firmly rooted in the evidence. And when the evidence changes, that's when my opinions change. So if anyone's reading into these materials as being necessarily politically motivated, I would suggest that they are not.
Well, and that's, again, your humility is it's refreshing. So an expert, not maybe the expert, but an expert. But that's exactly what it is. It's evidence-based opinions based on years of research, and research not only you've done, but others have done as well. So when I first met you, I don't know if you remember actually meeting me. We were at a gala for the John Howard Society when they were announcing their traditional housing. And one of the things at the time, it was shortly after the 2023 provincial election, and we were talking about the community policing op-ed that you wrote in the Brandon Sun about the community standards bylaw. And that was a bylaw that was written by now MLA Wayne Balkin, who was then police chief when he wrote it. And that's kind of what started the conversation, because you've been very active and very outspoken about that bylaw and other law enforcement measures that have taken place. Now, again, what I really want to know, and this is an open-ended question, which is so vague, you're going to laugh at me because you are an academic, but I want to know what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong and where we need to go to solve some of these problems that have just constantly been ongoing, because I don't see any movement, right? We keep talking about these issues. We talked about them in 2023. Here it is, almost 2026, and we're still having the same conversations. So where are we going? Like, what's needed here?
I mean, I think we could start with talking about the community standards bylaw. Um, I want to believe that the reason why it is still in place is that most of the people who live in Brandon are unaware of the community standards bylaw, how it was put together and passed. And in my view, I think that many, indeed most Brandonites would be on board with repealing the current community standards bylaw. So when we look at policing more broadly, there are two sort of basic ways of policing society. There's a policed state and a policed society. So police states is where, none of us here in Canada want to live. So these are places like North Korea, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. But the other societies, including democratic societies like Canada, are policed societies. And when you look at the community standards bylaw, something that received a lot less attention, as you noted at the outset, was Mr. Wayne Balkin, so then Chief of Police Balkin of the Brandon Police Service. He co-authored the community standards bylaw. Now, I think that we can see, and I don't know if I need to make a real strong argument here, how wildly inappropriate that is for the police to be writing the laws that the police officers are going to be enforcing. This is consistent with a policed state. And again, which I think all across the political spectrum in Brandon, Manitoba, probably we can universally agree we don't want a police state. This is why we elect representatives to then go to our Ottawa and amend the criminal code. It's sort of one step removed. The police, and this is police across the country, and indeed in other democratic societies, routinely tell us that they are apolitical, meaning that they are not to be politically involved. And indeed, when police are politicized, people get very upset by this. So we recall the Emergency Measures Act, which was invoked by Prime Minister Trudeau to clear the Ottawa trucker protest. And people were very angry about that because that was seen as overreach. And indeed, later discussions determined that it was, in fact, a government overreach. We look, for example, when Ontario Premier Doug Ford provided or announced rather that he was going to be providing arbitrary police powers to stop and question anyone in Ontario in April of 2021, anyone who was leaving their home. So this was in an effort to curb mobility in relation to COVID restrictions. Ontarians lashed out. There was backlash across the political spectrum. People were very angry about this. And Premier Ford near immediately apologized and walked back the announcement of the powers he was going to be giving to police in Southern Ontario or in Ontario more broadly. When we look at the community standards bylaw, those two things I just pointed out about police overreach, we have that enshrined in law in Brandon, Manitoba. So if the listeners and watchers of this podcast were upset by the other things I noted, we should be upset about the community standards bylaw. So again, being written by the police officers are bylaw officers, so they're enforcing this law. And there are numerous issues to point out with the community standards bylaw, in addition to the police authoring the law that the police are upholding. One of those would be the change in definitions. There are several arbitrary definitions and vague definitions, which essentially enhance police powers, and we could make a serious argument here, provide arbitrary police powers to stop and question anyone. And I'd like to point the listeners and watchers to the definition of noise in the current community standards bylaw that exists in Brandon, Manitoba. So noise in the previous bylaw was in reference to harsh or brash sounds, something to this extent. And the definition of noise was literally changed in the current bylaw to any sound. Now, there's a few things worth pointing out here. The majority of calls for service to police, and this is more broadly as outlined in the research literature, are actually noise complaints. People call police for noise complaints and to, the neighbors are playing their music too loud or whatever it is. Chief Balkin, of course, is very well aware of this, obviously being the chief of police about the calls coming in for noise complaints. So by emboldening and expanding this sort of arbitrary enforcement of noise, as it were, to any sound, provides unlimited discretionary powers to police in Brandon, Manitoba. Essentially, what this means is within the city limits of Brandon, if an officer hears any sound, which can include breathing, coughing, the jiggling of car keys, babies crying, an engine on your car. I mean, we could grow this list.
Well,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to interrupt, but I just think back to 2023, and I remember having these conversations about this noise issue. And at that time, it was kind of joked off about how police would never go to those extents. Like just because, technically they could doesn't mean they would. And so much has changed in the last 2 years. And we are seeing things happening south of the border that we never thought we'd see in our lifetime. That I think it's really, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, is that we can't take that for granted anymore, that we really need those protections um, in place. And this idea that, in Brandon, the police now have this authority to stop and question anyone that's deemed, making noise if they so choose. And it's not just noise, it was the loitering definition of loitering as well that really had me concerned because it leaves so much up to individual determination. If a police, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if a police officer in Brandon sees three people standing on a street corner, legally he can stop, question them, ask them what they're doing because technically they're loitering. And it's totally up to his discretion or her discretion. And that concerns me because as we've seen, happening in different areas across the world, we're seeing different types of discretion with racial undertones, with socioeconomic undertones. If perhaps you and myself were standing on a street corner having a discussion at 8 p.m. at night, we might be fine. But if, two, teenagers of different ethnicity were, they might be perceived differently. And that's opening this door up to this racialized profiling that I thought we'd moved past 20 years ago.
I mean, and no, we haven't moved past that, unfortunately. The number of people doesn't matter. If I'm talking to myself, I'm making noise. If a police officer can hear me blink, technically, that's any sound. And again, to embolden police to have this sort of authority to stop and question anyone in any of these situations is wildly problematic. And what's even more problematic, of course, is that Wayne Balkin and the Brandon Police Service both refused to comment on this legislation. And they should absolutely, in a democratic society, be brought forth to comment on this legislation and tell Brandon citizens why they think and why Chief Wayne Balkin and now current MLA Mr. Balkin thought it was appropriate to write the law this way that the police officers, his police officers, would be enforcing. And when we talk about loitering, the definition in the bylaw is something to the extent of move slowly without apparent purpose. And what in the hell does that mean, right? Senior citizens move pretty slowly. Children move pretty slowly. I suspect probably that the bylaw is not going to be used for either one of those two groups of people. But again, what it does is expand police discretionary powers in a way that makes them essentially unlimited. And this is an interesting area in the policing research and indeed with the Canadian public is most people agree that police should have discretion. Okay. But when we talk about police discretion, there's no political consensus on what it should look like, how it's defined. And the people, police officers who have the highest levels of discretion are often the youngest, the least trained, and the least experienced who are utilizing their discretion. I think Canadians would probably prefer police officers with 20, 30 years of experience utilizing their discretion, but rather we've got, young people who, are fresh out of training, again, with least experience, least training, with the most levels of discretion. And, this is I think, a concern. And, there are numerous other issues also in the bylaw. Blasphemy was reintroduced into the bylaw, which is quite puzzling because it's antiquated language. The Canadian Senate removed sort of the last blasphemous legislation in 2018. So sounds that are considered to be blasphemous, which typically is understood as being insulting or condemning God, are now in the current bylaw that was passed in 2023. And here we are in 2025 in a society that is secular. We don't.
I
So
didn't
why
know
why
that.
was that introduced into the? Yeah.
I didn't know that. And, you know, preparing for this discussion today, I went back and read the article that you wrote in the Brandon Sun, and I read some of the things I wrote about it at the time, because since then, some other things have changed. We've seen an introduction of mental health units working with the police services. I know you have some very strong opinions of that. You
Evidence
know,
based, evidence based, evidence based.
evidence-based, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because it is so important to kind of grasp, because I know that there's going to be people listening to this saying, yes, but the streets in downtown Brandon or Winnipeg or wherever we are, but we're talking about Brandon right now, they're unsafe. So we need these protections in place. That's why the police need this type of discretion. But we also
Well,
know that the police aren't properly trained with mental health and addictions, and
I mean,
dealing
the
with people in
feeling,
crisis.
it's the perception and the feeling that it's unsafe. And when we look to the research literature, the more police we add, for example, this makes people feel safer. However, that does not translate necessarily into concrete reductions in crime, which would then lead to increased community safety. We know, and I use the we as scholars and people who study and research this, how to fix the problem. It's a simple solution, but it's a solution that would take time to sort of manifest into its realization and money. And unfortunately, these things are short-lived in relation to the election cycles. So we see now all political parties, from the left to the right, have some sort of tough on crime agenda, including the NDP, right? They took a couple of talking points from the conservatives about tough on crime, and the conservatives typically have the strongest tough on crime discussions. And when people vote political parties in who are tough on crime, typically this results in more police officers, more weaponry, more police squad cruisers, and so on, which again all comes from taxpayer dollars. And then people, they feel better about it, they feel safer. But then, the next election cycle, another 4 years later, we have the same tough on crime agenda. And the research literature is crystal clear. Tough on crime does not work the way in which currently it's enacted by political parties. Rather, if we really want to make concrete reductions in crime, we should be taking, money, taxpayer money, instead, and spending it on things like affordable housing, drug rehabilitation centers, job training, education, healthcare. The research literature is crystal clear that investing in these infrastructures leads to concrete reductions in crime and therefore increased community safety. And it makes the job for police officers easier because now there's less crime and it's safer for police and safer for people. However, those are like long-term investments, and they typically don't manifest in an election cycle in 4 years, right? If you get the money to say build a rehabilitation center, for instance, they're going to break ground on that. It's going to take years and the construction, and then all the while, we don't see those concrete reductions in crime yet. The public get mad, and then they vote that political party out for a different political party that has the tough on crime agenda. They put more police officers in the streets, and we have wash, rinse, repeat. And this has been the cycle for decades and decades in the United States, in Canada, in Brandon, Manitoba, and it will continue. And unfortunately, very little will change in relation to leading to, again, concrete reductions in crime. But people will feel better about it. And the research literature tells us that they feel
Yeah.
safer, but it doesn't necessarily translate into actual safety.
Well, and you're preaching to the choir, because I have been saying, I know that there's things that I've read that you've said that I have a very different perspective on, just because of my background as a recovering addict. So I look at things a little bit different. But in general, I've been saying the same thing for years, is that we need to address the root causes of these issues. We need poverty reduction, like you said, affordable housing, education, mental health, healthcare. We need these things. But you nailed it. And you said it so much better than I do, because I tend to get mad because I've said it so often, that we need long-term solutions. That this idea that, we need a political party that's willing to say, we've got the solution, but it's going to take 16 years. And nobody wants to see that. They want immediate results. They want to feel like something's being done. And And it's so frustrating because right now, when I talk about, and last week I just did a podcast talking about, I just celebrated my 25th year of being opioid and narcotic free, but I'm having the same conversations about addicts and drug rehabs and the illness, mental illness behind addictions that we had 25 years ago. It's the same conversation. We're talking about meth right now, and fentanyl. Back in my day, it was cocaine and heroin, but it's the same conversation. And we're seeing, the same attitudes coming forward of tough on crime, three strikes, bail reform. I watched Patrick Allard. I keep laughing over this, give a presentation to the committee for that's working on the 72-hour detox hold in Winnipeg. And he talks about how we just need strong messaging and we need to bring back the video of the egg. This is your brain, and it blows my mind that we are still having these conversations, and yet no one seems to want to understand that we need long-term investment, that we're not going to see the results in 4 years. And everything that we've done, we've tried this tough on crime. I think it was actually Wayne Balkin that's actually been said, we're not going to arrest our way out of this. And yet
Yeah,
here are these policies that, now he's an MLA and his party is
well,
still talking about this.
this is these are all band-aid solutions. So, the key point here is police cannot and never will be able to address the underlying socioeconomic conditions, sociocultural conditions that give rise to crime and different types of crime. Um, let's take a ridiculous example to illustrate to the listeners and watchers of this. So we know in the scientific research literature that young men disproportionately commit crime. And there are a lot of different reasons for that, and we don't need to go into all that right now, but that's those are empirical facts. So let's say, for example, we can easily fix crime in Brandon, Manitoba. We just remove all the young men, send them all to Saskatchewan, make them all move to Milford, Saskatchewan or something, and that could be their problem. And then crime will go down here. That's ridiculous and insane. Police can't do that. We can't do that, nor should we be doing that. But that's this example where, that's just one instance. But you could take numerous examples, mental health issues, addictions issues, limited access to job opportunities, healthcare, education. And we could keep growing that list of all these different underlying factors that, when they're absent or underfunded, give rise to crime, give rise to addictions issues, which then also could give rise to crime, and so on and so forth. And typically, every election cycle, the response is, slap the police on it. As you noted with Wayne Balkin, they come in and they can wrest their way out of it. Let's revoke, bail and the so-called bail reform. Let's, introduce 72-hour holds. What's next? 7-day holds, 30 days hold, a month hold, 2 months. I mean, where does it end? And with the 72-hour, the change in the hold that the government is currently talking about that for people who are intoxicated, I'd like to see and hear from professionals in relation to what's the evidence for the 72 hours. So, for example, does a meth high or a fentanyl high last for 72 hours? I don't know. And rather hear from a medical doctor. Why isn't it not 25 hours and 22 minutes or 4 days? Or is it based on any kind of evidence, this reasoning? And, another thing, and again, I want to be very clear here. I think most people, including the police officers, maybe even including Wayne Malkin, they're trying to do good things, and I think their intentions are good. But we all know that expression, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And a lot of these rules, these community standards bylaw, the legislation are not really well thought out. And there's often not a lot of discussion with people who are experts in the field who study these things, medical doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, academics, and so on, to really come to a clear understanding of what are some of the possible consequences of this. For example, if we hold somebody for 72 hours on the basis of the belief that they're high, who's going to be making this determination? What role does discretion factor in here? How will we know if somebody is not exhibiting mental health issues or problems, or if that's being conflated as an understanding of high, and so on and so forth? Let's just say they are high and we hold them for 72 hours. That could actually put these people's lives immediately at risk because you can go into withdrawal symptoms and you can die if you don't get the next hit. Will methadone or other sorts of medical interventions be available to ensure that people don't go into withdrawal and die as a result of their symptoms? Will it be policed, as it were, in the same way? So, we have facilities, for example, we're opening one here in Brandon, Manitoba, but also in Winnipeg, where we have centers where there will be EMS and trained personnel who will be able to, assess individuals when they're being on hold, should this pass for 72 hours. But what about, up north, where you have an RCMP detachment with two officers? Are there medical professionals going to be placed up there with this hold? How do we know that police officers, for example, won't utilize this as a punitive measure if somebody upsets them when they're trying to arrest them and they decide to hold them essentially arbitrarily for 72 hours based on their discretion that they say this person is high? Who's going to be checking their checks and balances? Will there be accountability measures in place? These sorts of things provide so many more questions than answers. And unfortunately, when we see in the news media, we see politicians, we see police administrators discussing these things, it's often slapdash. Oh, we're going to do this and it's going to make everything awesome. And a lot of the general public are not really thinking through these things very carefully, which isn't to suggest that they're stupid. People
No.
are busy, they're working full time. You got kids and families, and yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that. And we're not really talking about this. And we need to be super, super important and mindful when we make these decisions because we're talking about some of the most marginalized people in our society. That we need to ensure that we have the proper infrastructure and barriers in place so that we can care for these people, and especially if we're looking at depriving them of their liberty, right? Taking, a 72-hour hold, and ensure that it's not arbitrary and ensure that it doesn't violate the charter and
You you
charter
brought
rights. And
you brought
go
up a
ahead.
good point because so I spoke in favor of the 72-hour detox center that they want to open in Point Douglas and Winnipeg. And I spoke specifically about that center and the proposal I saw where it was medically staffed with EMS, mental health assessment. That's what I was talking about. I never thought about the change in legislation being used in other areas, such as I'm from northern Manitoba, such as you just described. I was speaking specifically for this center or this type of center with these types of wraparound supports, which is the understanding of it would be there. I actually spoke out saying that I would prefer to have a safe consumption site, but that is off the table again for some of these short-sighted views of safety and political reasons. But you brought up a really good point there that even though I've been very much advocating for that center in Point Douglas, um, I never thought further beyond that as to what happens if this new legislation is misused based on discretion, which is where we started this conversation. So how do we do that though? Because my thought, and I shared this last week, is my thought is that we're constantly talking about doing things, but we never actually do them. Because by the time we get around to it, it's a new election, new government. Even if they started it, they wipe it clean and start over again. We've spent millions of dollars. When do we just say, let's do something? Let's move forward. Like, what's the steps? What can we do to, because I wish that people didn't have to feel unsafe, and I wish that solutions weren't band-aids to make them feel safer. But there's that balance between their feelings and populist politics that we need to find a bridge for so we could get some real solutions. So, I know this is longer than, the next 5 minutes of this conversation, but you've studied this for a long time. Like, where do we move forward in our communities? Whether it's Brandon or, the small rural towns that are getting caught up in this fight and this unsafe feeling, how do we move forward to actually make real differences?
I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? I
Yes.
think we're living in
I
an
don't
era
have a
that's
billion
been,
dollars for you, but I
yeah.
got like 5 minutes. Solve the world's problems.
that's the question that is very difficult to address, and I think even more so in our current era in 2025. When you have everybody's opinion matters just the same. We have, the sort of the reduction or disrespect of people who study these areas because, their opinions don't matter, the evidence doesn't matter, and indeed, in certain circumstances, the evidence becomes politicized, right? This is bleeding heart liberal nonsense. We're not going to be investing our taxpayer resources in a drug rehabilitation center. You have individuals who some people don't care about drug addicts. Some people's perspective is let them die, that they're making these choices and, too bad for them. Too
Absolutely,
bad,
I've
so
heard
sad.
that.
Yeah, right. So like the answer to your question is it's damn near impossible to get everybody on board with any one particular idea. I think there are places we can start. So what I think would be a really good idea, we talked about the community standards bylaw. I think that the Brandon citizens, in the way that I just presented it, if people are in favor of giving police unrestricted powers like we saw during COVID or the other examples I gave with the Ottawa trucker convoy protest, we're never going to win those people over. But I think most people across the political spectrum are not okay with this, especially judging on the reaction when Premier Ford announced that he's going to be doing this, and there was near universal backlash. So I think in Brandon, we, the citizens of Brandon, should demand that the MLA, Mr. Balgan, come forward and tell us why he thought that authoring the bylaw was appropriate, why he thought that changing the definition to noise to any sound was appropriate, what his thinking and reasoning was behind that. We live in a democracy, and he's an elected politician. I think the Brandon Police Service should be brought forth to answer for this. I think that the councilors, it was voted in 9-1. There was one vote against it. I think all of the city councilors and the mayor should all be brought to task and account to explain the reasoning why they thought this was a good idea to provide police with arbitrary powers to stop and talk to anyone at any time in the city of Brandon. And you know what? I don't think they're going to be able to make a case, which is why there's been pretty silence around it. And I think most people in Brandon are unfamiliar with this. And all of which what I just described is consistent with democracy. And I think that's one way of responding to your billion-dollar question. I mean, there are different ways of responding and not, a concrete, clear answer is to, go back to the constituents, right? Explain yourself. Because if you're going to be making these rules that are going to affect people here, any of us at any time, we should know why, and we should be provided with an account. And if you can't provide a good answer or response to that, then this should be changed. It should be repealed. It should be amended based on
What
how
you
we think.
what you're really advocating for is an educated, informed electorate. And I love that. I've been fighting for that. And I think, as ironic as it is that I am so active on social media, that social media really has divided this world because of the way the algorithms work, right? If you it's a vehicle for cognitive dissonance that you only ever see things that agree with your opinion and you never see the things that don't. And we've lost the ability to, like you said, the scientists, the experts, the ones with the knowledge and the education and the research like yourself are discredited because a politician posts a meme. And and that's where we've come. So getting out there, having those conversations, I would love to see it. We do have a municipal elections are coming up, not fast enough as far as I'm concerned. I think it's 2027, where we're going to see a lot of these issues. I hope. I really do, because we're going to see, actually, that's the provincial election, but we're going to see a continuation of this. And the damage I see being done right now with our political system and the back and forth. And like you said, there really is no left and right anymore. It's whatever seems to be popular in the moment. And a lot of that is being driven by social media. And, I don't even want to give any more airtime to Trump, but what we're seeing come across. And what I'm hoping to do is find some solutions. And even if it's those small things about, let's look at this bylaw. And I think you nailed it when you said The same people that are so angry and demanding all of these huge reforms are the ones that would oppose a bylaw like this, but on the small stuff where we can affect change, they're silent. Everyone's focused on the big stuff. And meanwhile, right here in our community, we have these overreaches that are damaging. And like you said, it might make people feel safe, but it doesn't actually do anything to curb crime or the state of the streets.
And it might very well cost us a lot of money. And I say us, the taxpaying citizens of Brandon, if this bylaw is subject to a charter challenge, who's going to pay for it? The taxpayers. And that's going to be a big problem because we could have invested that money elsewhere.
Well,
It's been suggested that it could be subject to a charter challenge, and it may very well be.
it'll be interesting because, I constantly hear every time that I see someone coming forth with a new idea, a solution, whether it is affordable housing, healthcare, mental health, even just, feeding children in school. Everybody always puts a price tag on it. They're not willing to pay, but they're never seem to have a problem paying for more police, more jails, more institutions. And I might be a little obsessed, but I have to go back to Trump here. When you're cutting healthcare and you're cutting food access to increase military, that's this disconnect that I don't want to see happen here, where we are focusing on the wrong things when we really need to be working on solutions for the long term instead of band-aids, like you said. And I'm actually
And
shocked that this bylaw is still in place.
yeah, you and me both. And again, I convince myself, and I want to believe, is because most people don't know about it, and it has not been framed in the way that I just presented it about, providing unlimited arbitrary powers to police in Brandon, Manitoba, which is what it does. When it's presented that way, I think many people would get upset about it. And I agree with what you're saying. One of the issues that we're really up against is within the policing research literature, there's something called police image work or brand management. And as an institution, like all institutions, including the one I work at, universities, they're constantly, these institutions, promoting the need for these institutions, right? So the university will tell you that education is a public good and we should have more professors and we should educate the public, and they make claims and rationale for this. And I agree with a lot of what they're saying, and the police are no different, right? The police are good, and they help reduce crime, and we need more police officers to make things safer. The difference, I think, between these two institutions is the police have a lot more power and a lot more access to media, and media will give them more airtime, more print time, and they're able to advance and develop the claims that they're making to convince the public that we're living in a post-apocalyptic hellscape. And if we don't get more police officers and more weaponry and more cars, someday it's going to be you. Next time it's going to be your kid. And fear is a powerful thing. There's been a lot of research literature. David Altidy, for example, wrote several books on utilizing fear to control the public, control the masses, right? And using media in this context. And if you can make people afraid, they were very willingly and voluntarily give up their civil liberties and a variety of other things because they're afraid. Fear is a powerful tool, and the police and politicians, a lot of them are masters at leveraging fear to convince people that they need to do the things that the institution or the administrators, the politicians are telling them they need to do. Regarding fear, there's been sort of numerous scholars and publications that have addressed how politicians and other groups of people utilize fear to control people. It's a tale as old as time. If you can get people to be afraid of something, often they'll voluntarily and willingly give up their civil liberties and sort of go along with whatever it is the person that is selling the fear or marketing the fear. And this becomes problematic because when we think about things like crime, people are afraid of crime. When you look at it being assaulted or having your purse stolen or your house burned down, something like arson. And different groups of people, politicians, police agencies have sort of propagated these things in an effort to get people to be afraid. There's a whole history in the research literature called police image work. Others have called it police presentational strategies, police brand management, and so on. And like any other institution, police agencies sort of they promote these things because they're interested in getting more funding, more police officers, better raises, better benefits. Same with university professors. Same with people who work in a union at an auto plant. The difference or the key is that police have a sort of a direct line with media. So print media, television media, and there's a whole bunch of research that's been written on this. There's a really nice book by Rob Mulby that's actually called Policing Images. It's all about image work, and it's as old as the policing institutional apparatus. And the idea is again, if you can get people to be afraid, it's easy to get them to bend to your will. So as I was saying, I don't think that people should not be concerned about crime. We should absolutely be concerned about crime. But there's a difference between being concerned about something and being afraid of something. Think about the saying we've all heard, which is kind of unusual if you unpack it, fear of the unknown. How can you be afraid of something you don't know about? I mean, you'd have to have information or knowledge to know what you're even being afraid of. Fear is it's visceral, it's reactionary, and there's often not a lot of thought or judgment on the basis of evidence in relation to fear. However, when you're concerned and people are concerned, that's exactly what people do, right? Concern incorporates judgment. It's thoughtful, it's thought out. I mean, think, for example, when people are concerned about their health or they go to the doctor and they find out something that's concerning. What are they concerned about? Okay, they've identified an issue. All right, how are we going to address this issue? What's the plan? What's the medical intervention? What sort of food should I eat? And people respond in ways that are thoughtful and concrete that address the very thing that they're concerned about. Fear is the opposite of all that, right? Visceral, reactionary, not a whole lot of thought going into it. And we should be concerned about crime. We should be concerned about crime prevention, crime reduction, of course. All people are on board in relation to those things. And then the question becomes, well, how then do we address it? What is the evidence? What approach should we take? Where should we, the tax-paying citizens, invest our taxpayer dollars with the best likelihood of reducing crime and making society better and increasing community safety? That seems like a nonsensical question. Can you imagine if somebody went into a casino and said, "Where's the place where I can put all my money and bet on here, where it's the least likely that I'm going to win money?" Nobody would do that. It's crazy. When you go into a casino, you're like, "What are my best odds? What game is going to help me win the most money, or whatever it may or may not be?" And we should approach, I think, strategies to reducing crime in a similar way. And uh, thinking like this and reorienting or reframing to thinking like this, I hope will get people to move beyond this obsession with the political cycle and what politicians and other talking heads are saying essentially to get reelected. I mean, this is the basic issue is that, this whole tough on crime agenda is exactly that. In the research literature, you can go read, there's been lots written on this, is politicians will say things that it sounds great, it makes people feel warm and fuzzy, and then 4 years later, nothing has changed, and the politicians are saying the same thing, and the other politicians are saying the same thing, and then we vote for the same thing, and then we wonder why nothing ever changes. So to sort of remove ourselves, the royal we, Canadians, people in Brandon, communities, from the political cycle of discussing all this tough on crime stuff and going to, how are we going to actually lead to concrete change? What sort of investments can we make? What's best for our community? And the answer in different communities might be different things. One community, for instance, you mentioned there might be a rash of people with mental health issues who are living in the streets, who are unhoused because they have mental health issues. Okay, so probably in those communities, it'd be really great if we invested in infrastructure and resources, a clinic, a place where these individuals could go so they can be assessed for their mental health. They can be given the appropriate drugs, for example, to help them with their mental health. We can streamline them into job training, other sorts of things, and help these people cycle back into being productive members of society. Like, nobody wants to have mental health issues. Nobody wants to be addicted to drugs. These things happen for a variety of reasons, social reasons, cultural reasons. And if we can invest in the infrastructure and resources to ensure these things are less likely to happen, they're never not going to happen. people are going to do drugs. People are going to experience mental health crisis. It's unfortunate, but what we can do is again sort of buttress that in ways with resources to ensure that when people slip between the cracks, as some people do, that we can pull them back up. And we should all care because someday it might be you, someday it might be your kid, it might be your mom, and we should care about people as our fellow human beings. And this is another problem with the politicization of the left and the right and everywhere is like I hate those people because they don't think like me, and they hate me because I don't think like them. And we're all screaming and yelling past each other. No one's talking to each other anymore. And this is a big issue. This is a big problem in a place like Canada, Brandon, Manitoba, that we fancy ourselves being a democracy. Like, are we? I mean, what's happening? It sort of seems like it's coming apart at the seams. But we can take the reins back. We can take control. We can reach across the aisle, as it were, and start to have conversations about how to best move forward where it benefits everybody. And I think that's the answer.
I agree. Like, I'm actually at a loss for words because you 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 put it into such great context. Like you said it so well that it really comes down to building those bridges and getting past the partisan politics, getting past the anger to the true issues. And I think anger is just a symptom of fear. And people get afraid. And I was just kind of lost in thought a little bit because earlier you said statistically, most crimes are committed by young men. And then I see what's happening with, I don't know if I'd use the word radicalization of young men, but the anger, the fear, the fear of the othering that's happening when we look at vulnerable communities, when we see, a rise in publicly acceptable bigotry and racism and the othering and we're seeing a lot of movements of Proud Boys and these the Second Sons rally we saw and it just kind of hit me while you were talking that it really is all about fear. It's about fear of losing, whether it's fear of losing privilege or fear of the unknown of what's going to happen. But a lot of the imagery and most of that is done, on social media. It's like, look at this, you take one case of a violent act committed by someone of a group, and now it's this fear that they're coming for you. Or, the movements that we've seen in Brandon with the parental rights, and that's going to happen. It's going to be this fear, and there's so much anger based on that fear that there's not a lot of conversation. So how, if that's the first step to these solutions, I this might be an unfair question, but you are a professor of sociology. How do we have those conversations? How does someone like me who wants to advocate for, um, you know, social equity or advocate for real change, and have those conversations? How do you reach someone that is so afraid that their fear is manifesting in anger? Like, how do we do that?
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer too. I think, I mean, bigotry is bonkers, and one way of sort of unpacking
I'm
that,
going to
and
use that. That I need that on a tote, on a shirt or something. That just sums it up right there.
one way of addressing that, I think, is when you look historically, it's pretty clear that laws and policies were passed that were explicitly discriminatory, racist, sexist. Women couldn't vote. Racialized people couldn't have jobs. All this other kind of nonsense. Um, Education was denied to people, denied to women, and people who weren't necessarily not white men. And the bigotry's bonkers bit is somebody out there has the cure for cancer. Somebody out there is going to figure it out. Is it the unhoused indigenous person in downtown Brandon, Manitoba, who has slipped through the cracks and has gotten addicted to drugs and just needs a little bit of help to bring them through the cracks and help them out and maybe open the door so that they can go and get education and advance themselves? Maybe they figure it out. Maybe that's the person who comes up with the cure for HIV/AIDS. Somebody's out there. These people are out there and giving everybody, lifting everybody up. All our people, all our brothers and sisters, lifting them up together is better for all of us. When you think of it like that, when we intentionally exclude people or we dismiss people or we other people because they're different than us, uh, does that person have the cure for cancer? Again, maybe, maybe. And I think at that point, that's where bigotry ends, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm dying of cancer, but damn it, I hate such and such group, and this person from such and such group, I'm not going to let them fix me because they're from such and such group, and I'm going to die from cancer. I think few bigots are that committed, to dying for their belief in that way. And I think that's one way of approaching this conversation with people is that we need to recognize all people in their humanity, in their agency, and I think it becomes difficult when we've been conditioned in the process of othering that people who aren't like us are culturally different than us. They have a different sexual orientation that we might have, and people are incapable or unwilling to see themselves through the eyes of the other. And I think we need to boost and further explore things like compassion and empathy for other people, because again, someday it could be you, whether it's or someone you care about, and then all of a sudden you're going to change your tune and say, hey, we need more money to invest in drug rehabilitation centers because my kid now is addicted to opioids, and you're going to look around and people are going to be like, no, we don't care about that. We want to have more cops out here. We want to arrest our way out of the problem. And that then what? So to try to put yourselves in the perspective of the other, I think goes a long way for developing empathy and hopefully a little bit of understanding, which then could then give rise to dialogue with people who are unlike us and different than us, which doesn't make them bad or morally inferior or any of this kind of nonsense, but it just makes them different. And when we talk about Canada being a multicultural society, that's one of the things that we applaud about Canada. And if we're gonna really applaud that and do that, we need to, again, talk to people who are different than you. Diversify your friend group. Get the perspective of the other. This is going to help to, to smash or abolish bigotry, right? Because again, bigotry is bonkers, and bigotry doesn't end well. It never has ended well. When you look historically, the historical record's pretty clear, right? It can lead to things, and it's in extreme form, genocide, the extermination of people. I mean, some really repugnant stuff, and we want to make sure that the guardrails are in place, that these things don't happen in places like Canada and places that we cherish. And if we cherish democracy and where we live, we need to ensure that the guardrails are in place and that they're going to protect the rights and of all people, and going to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people, including people who are unhoused and might be addicted to drugs or think differently than you, that they're a person. They're a person and they deserve that from all of us, and we all deserve that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. You've given me a lot to think about. And, one thing I love about these conversations is we start off in one direction and end up going down, all of these different roads. And that's why I do what I do, because every time I have a conversation with someone new on my show, I learn something and I walk away thinking about things way differently. And I think you've convinced me that maybe some of my approaches can use a little softening around the edges, and maybe I'm just as guilty as some of the people that I tend to accuse in my view of othering, you know, um, and maybe I need to start looking for more of the humanity and the connection and the things we have in common instead of the things that we have that we don't agree on. And that's something I'm going to commit to trying to do a lot better than I have been, because my emotions sometimes get the best of me, not so much fear but frustration, and even that closes down doors, and those are the doors we need to keep open. So thank you so much for being here and like blowing my mind. You've got me thinking about all sorts of things. I hope you come back and we talk more about this and other things. I know you got a new book coming out in January that I'm super excited. But thank you so much for having this discussion with me, because it's always amazing to me when you sit down and talk. Like you drew that perspective of, when you go to the doctor and you ask for health care, and as someone who's just recently been battling cancer, that made me think of it so clearly. It's you're right. We don't sit there and argue and fight and go, yes, but I want, I'm not going to accept that advice on how to do things. I'm going to go, down this aisle because it's faster, cheaper, whatever. And we really do need to look for the solutions with that kind of open mind and being willing to talk about it. And thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you
having
very
me.
much.
I may be a professor, but I'm also a student, and we're all students of life, right? And there's always things to be learned to help us sort of
Well, one
think.
of the things that, I don't know if I said this to you the first time I met you, but one of the things I love talking to you is you are like this academic, right? You have a PhD, you have all of this academic research and working in post-secondary, but you don't talk like it. You don't talk down, you don't use these, academic terms that make it unapproachable for most of us. And that is that human connection that you can make talking to people that absolutely blows me away. That was the first conversation we had, and I was like, wow, you made that make sense. And you didn't make me feel like an idiot. And I appreciate that because too often, and I think it's really exclusionary that when we do talk to someone who has a lot of expertise and a lot of education and a lot of research behind them, it's really hard to understand at their level. But when you can simplify it and make it accessible, that shows true understanding. You having someone say with a PhD and a professor of sociology just summarize it and say bigotry is bonkers. That sums it up. Like, thank you. I really do. I learned a lot today. I appreciate it.
I appreciate that, your kind words. That means a lot. Thank you. I mean, to make ideas not accessible is just doesn't make any sense. And I often say that in my classes, right? I tell the students, we're going to make it make sense, and that's the point of learning, and we're all trying to learn, and we
Absolutely.
should all learn together. But I appreciate. Thank you very much for having me and your kind words. That means a lot.
I definitely learned a lot. And for everyone who's listening, thank you for joining us. Play this back. This has been an incredible conversation. Save it, rewind it, come back to it. I know I'm going to because there was a lot to unpack here. And this is going to be one of those tools and conversations I come back to multiple times. So, again, Dr. Schneider from Brandon University. And to everyone listening, share your thoughts. Let me know what you think. And you might see a softer, more accessible Michelle in the coming days. So, thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Michelle.
That's it for this episode of Real Talk, where we tackled the hardest conversations because they are the ones we need the most. I can't wait to hear your thoughts and opinions. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay real, stay engaged, and keep living your authentic truth.